My name's Emma Boynton and I'm an outreach and engagement librarian at Western Sydney University. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker as today's event is quite a special one. Most of our thought leadership speakers come to our awareness because their research has attracted quite a bit of attention. They may have had magazine articles written about them or done interviews with the media. Today's a little bit different. It started with a book. Like a good librarian, I was browsing some recent titles and a book with an attractive dark cover, a falling female figure and flowers caught my eye. It was called Because I'm Not Myself, You See, by Ariane Beast. I read the book and found it a really powerful and moving first-hand account of postpartum psychosis. And it really opened my eyes to the importance of the issues surrounding this condition. I was amazed to see that the author had quoted a 2021 journal article in the Journal of Midwifery entitled The River of Postnatal Psychosis, a qualitative study of women's experiences and meanings by Diana Jefferies, Virginia Schmid, Athena Sheehan, and Margaret Dunn. I immediately got in touch with Dr. Diana Jefferies, a Western Sydney University researcher, to ask her about her and her colleagues' work. After some discussion, we decided to have this event. And what really stands out about Dr. Jeffrey's work is that it really showcases and focuses on women's experiences, feelings, and agency. And today we'll be discussing the power of published autobiography as a means of understanding postpartum psychosis. Dr. Jeffries is very happy to be sharing her knowledge with you all today, both here in the room and to our participants online. Dr. Jefferies is a senior lecturer in the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Western Sydney University. She has a clinical background in mental health and HIV/AIDS nursing and an academic background in the humanities. It is this interdisciplinary combination of knowledge that sparked her interest in exploring how women make meaning of their mental distress after childbirth, their access to healthcare, response to treatment, and any strategies they may use to promote recovery. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diana Jefferies.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's an absolute pleasure to be.
So this will be interview style. I'd like to start by asking, what led you to explore autobiographies as a lens for understanding postpartum psychosis?
Well, autobiography is a really interesting genre in literary studies because it is about a person looking back on their life and making meaning of events that happened to them in so many different cases. So if you read an autobiography, you're getting a person's first-hand account of what they believed happened. Now, I put up here a very famous autobiography by Anne Frank, which was a diary that she wrote while she was hiding from the Nazis. And I think so many of us have read this particular diary. It was actually a day-to-day account of what was happening to her. And I think we all know that she didn't live much longer than when, after she finished this particular diary. But if we think of the effect that Anne Frank's account has had on our knowledge of what happened at that time and what it was like to live with such fear, I think we realise just the power of autobiography. So what it is it's an opportunity for us as readers to enter a person's world and to understand what the experiences are about. But there's a gender divide there. So a lot of biographies written by men are about great works and they're public works. We might think about great sportsmen who write their autobiographies. So I was actually looking for a few examples, or politicians. They talk about their public lives. So one example might be Glenn McGrath. He wrote an autobiography. He talks about his life in cricket. He does mention, I guess, his wife's illness and whatever, but he puts it through a cricket lens. Or you might read about, I don't know, Bob Hawke or something like that, where so much of his life is about what he did as Prime Minister and his contribution to the world. Women write differently. many women, when they write about their lives, they tend to write about their inner lives, their private lives, their lives at home and what they're doing. Especially, I guess, in the past when women's lives were dictated by their home life. So we learn about women's inner lives much more than we do about men's inner lives. And it is a big difference in gender divide when it comes to autobiography. Well, not all autobiographies, that's a sweeping statement. But you can say that there is that different lens there. Yeah, thanks, Mum. So when we're using an autobiography, I like I like to look back to Roland Barthes. I love Roland Barthes as a literary theorist. To me, he wrote the the death of the author in about 1968. That might be wrong. So any literary scholars out there, you can correct me. But what I like about Roland Barthes is he talked about that when anyone reads text, they create their own meaning of that text. So they rewrite the text over and over and over again. And I've always found that to be a really interesting way of looking at text. And then if we go back to it, we think about, I spent a lot of time when I started doing this work is reading the work of Rita Sharon, who used to talk about narrative medicine. She was at Columbia Medical School, and she used to talk about the importance of listening to patients. And she wrote a book that really influenced me, which was Narrative Medicine, Honouring the Stories of Illness. That came out in 2006. But she also referred back to Barthes. And she used to talk about the writerly text. And what she meant by that was the listening to what the patient said. What is the patient's story? What is their lived experience? How do they make sense of what they are going through when she talks to them? And then she used to talk about the writerly text rather than the readerly text. And that's for we as clinicians, and I'm talking about nurses here, we listen to the story and we start saying, oh, so they're talking about hallucinations. Oh, they're talking about delusion. Oh, they're saying they're depressed. And we start overwriting what the person is saying, and we put our own medical type interpretation on it. And from that, the person goes into treatment. Now, in many ways, that's very important that we do that. But sometimes we can do it to a point where it becomes a bit tick box. So rather than actually listening to what the person say, we might miss that because we're so busy saying, oh, yes, the person has all symptoms of this, that, and the other thing. It can also be a really kind of way of reducing the patient's story or the patient's life because we're looking for signs and symptoms. It's a deficit-based way of looking at a person. What we want to do is have a look at a more strength-based. And that comes through listening to what the person says and listening to how they might be talking about and what they might say they are doing that is helping their illness. So I guess autobiography is a way of understanding what's going on with people and how they make decisions about what they want. Now this has come down to us today in terms of person-centred care, which is an overarching framework in healthcare today and something that we're all teaching our nurses. My interest began when I started looking at autobiography. So I guess we look at why postpartum psychosis. Well, it's one of those things that people used to say when I started looking at this stuff way back in 2011, people say, oh, that's so rare. You know, we never hear about that anymore. Well, it's actually a psychiatric emergency that happens to women after childbirth. And they say it happens to 1 to 2 women in every 1,000 after childbirth. But when I started looking at birth statistics through the Australian Bureau of Statistics, I realised there was actually about 600 women a year in Australia who are likely to have an experience of postpartum psychosis based on those numbers. And it's a really traumatic and frightening experience for many women. It usually occurs in the first 4 weeks after childbirth. That's when symptoms start to happen. It can happen very quickly after childbirth. And it's often shown by a sudden onset of hallucinations, delusions, confused thinking and rapid mood swings. And it's very, 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 very frightening. But there is an increased risk of suicide, but less commonly infanticide. But this increased risk of suicide is really interesting because I think there was a paper that came out of the UK in 2006, and I think they were talking about a small group of women who had died by suicide. And when they went, and they said that the cause of the suicide was depression or anxiety, but when they went back into the notes and looked at the medical notes, there were symptoms of psychosis there that had been just missed. So there are a lot of long-term consequences, including psychological problems for the mother and the baby, as the process of bonding is interrupted. Now, one of the reasons why the bonding process can be interrupted is that the psychosis may not be picked up quickly and it may become very severe to the point where the woman has to be admitted into the psychiatric facility, an acute mental health unit, and they are separated from their baby during that time. Now, when I started working on this, there were no public mother and baby beds in New South Wales. There is today. There are beds at Westmead and there are beds at RPA. But during that time, the only place that mothers could go with their babies, if it was suitable, was to St John of God, a private facility. And if the mother couldn't afford that, well, they were often admitted into a public psychiatric hospital without their baby, and they lost that contact with their baby. But what was really interesting, I think, in the when we started talking to women who had had postnatal psychosis, about postpartum psychosis, in the current time, we interviewed a lot of women. We interviewed 10 women who'd had them in the last 10 years, is a lot of women realised very early on that something was very wrong. And they talked to people about their symptoms, and a lot of the symptoms revolved around sleep. And they'd say, I can't sleep. And people weren't listening to what the woman was saying. And they got responses like, well, of course you can't sleep. You just had a baby. The baby's going to keep you awake. But they weren't talking about what it was like to have a baby and not be able to sleep. What they were talking about, the fact is they could not sleep. They could not go to sleep. And it was part of their illness. So postpartum psychosis is something that can be easily treated, often with antipsychotic medication. But many women are not diagnosed until the conditions reach its most severe form and hospitalisation is required. And it becomes this incredibly traumatic experience. And I think through the autobiographies, you can see the trauma that this illness has brought on to the women. So I guess one of the reasons I really liked autobiography is I could really look at what women were experiencing and what women were saying. And I think that's a very important thing that we need to do as health professionals. Well, next,
Shall I'll ask the next question?
ask the next question.
So my next question is, what common themes did you find across the autobiographies you studied, which spanned from the 15th century to today?
Well, I just thought I'd talk to you a little bit about the 15th century biography. It's called A Book of Marjorie Kemp. And I think in circles, in literary circles, especially in circles where they talk about older texts, Marjorie Kemp is very well known, but she's not very well known outside of those circles. To me, Marjorie Kemp gives a unique first-person account of postnatal psychosis or postpartum psychosis. I have here, I've actually got a picture of the manuscript as it is in the British Library. As you can see, it's not like the Book of Kells, if you've ever seen that in Dublin. It's a very different kind of look. But it's quite a long piece of work where Marjorie actually describes her life. And I've given you a little potted history of Marjorie here, which I'll let you read. But I think what's really interesting is that she opens her autobiography and what she immediately says is she talks about her postpartum psychosis. She said, when I was about 20, I married a worthy man and everything was good. But I became pregnant and through my pregnancy, I felt ill at ease, she says. And then in 70 lines, she describes an 8.5-month period of having psychosis, of being surrounded by devils. for 8.5 months and watching them kind of make her life really difficult for her. The hallucinations. She describes being locked up in the cellar and trying to kill herself. It's actually quite a disturbing 70 lines that she writes. It's very clear and it's very short, but it's a very poignant representation of her psychosis. And then she says, one morning she woke up and Jesus came to her and she felt better immediately. Now, when I look back and I think we're in the 15th century, I think, she put a very spiritual, a very religious worldview on her experience. She saw the reason for her illness as being sin, having a sin on her conscience. She thought she was going to die and she didn't have time to confess to the priest. The priest was harsh with her and then she became psychotic. And then at the end, she saw Jesus curing her. So to cut a long story short, because it is a long story, a very long story, Margaret spent the rest of her life trying to be close spiritually to Jesus. She says she has 14 children. We don't know if that's true or not. Even in King's Lynn, where she was, where she lived, there's no record. We know that she had one son, but there's no record of the other 13 children. We don't know what's happened there. But her whole life had been very much influenced by this illness that she had soon after she was married. The manuscript was discovered in 1934 and the first modern edition was established in 1940. And it was originally edited by Hope Allen, who also worked very closely with George Orwell. So it was a very literary piece of work.
Just to clarify, the book's written in Middle English and you're a scholar of Middle English?
Well, yes, I am a scholar of Middle English. I don't use my Middle English very often these days, but I did a PhD in Middle English. And the book is written in Middle English, but for anyone who's interested in Marjorie Kent, there are modern translations. So you don't have to read it in the Middle English. In Penguin, actually, I think there's a lot in Penguin. So please go to Divix if you're interested in Marjorie Kent and whatever. She became very influential. Yeah. So I just thought I'd first of all write about Marjorie Kent and then introduce the other two autobiographies. But I'll just describe how she described what happened to her. So what she says is, before childbirth, she says, and after she had conceived, she was afflicted with severe attacks of illness until the child was born. So I think that's something we found with all the women we interviewed. There were problems during pregnancy a lot of the time. And with the difficulty she had in childbirth and the sickness that before, she despaired of her life, thinking she may not live. So she was really worried about childbirth. And she had it, and the way she puts this only in one line, she didn't have an easy birth of her child. Then after childbirth, she says she went out of the mind and was astonishingly afflicted and affected by spirits for 8.5 months. So her hallucinations were all about spirits coming to her. And I think that's one of the things with psychosis that we know, that people tend to have hallucinations about what is current. These days we might have more hallucinations about science fiction things, but in the 1500s it was very much about spirits and things. Yeah, so that's how she described it. The second book, what came out in 2022, and it was by Amanda Thomas Walsh, who I met a couple of years ago when I was involved in another project that we might talk about later. And Amanda and I ended up talking about postnatal psychosis or postpartum psychosis for the feed. We were interviewed by Mark Pennell. Mark Pennell, I think his name was there. And Amanda told her story of what it was like to have postnatal psychosis. She was then writing a book, and with the help of her editor from Green Orders Press, she wrote a really short and pithy autobiography about what had happened to her. And it's a really good read because it's very succinct and it really describes how postnatal psychosis affected her. This was with her second pregnancy. So she had one child and then she had another child and became unwell. But if you think about what Amanda said, she talks about what happened to her and she said, it should have been a lovely day, but I didn't feel right. I was incredibly sad and found myself sitting in a cafe with my mother-in-law and crying at stuff that was a bit random. I told my mother-in-law I was crying about my aunt who couldn't have children. So she kind of like, Amanda realised that this was an unusual thought to be crying about her aunt who didn't have children. And that wasn't her. It was something that was outside what she would normally do. And he said, then she said, on another day, earlier that day, we'd been playing in the park, the kids and I was pushing them on swings. As they went higher and higher, so did my mood. So she knew there was something wrong. I felt euphoric and everything seemed magical and wonderful. So she's talking about how her mood changed. Now, we think back to the description, there are rapid mood changes. And that is exactly what she's writing there. One minute she's really sad over something quite random, and the next minute, because of children on the swing, she gets very happy. And later on, and this is 100 pages later, she said, I started to become scared of myself. I'm scared to stay home alone in case I accidentally or purposely do something to harm myself, or worse, I feel a complete dissociation with reality and the life I used to live. So that was another sign. I think she'd recovered from one episode of psychosis, but there was another small one. And she was able to describe pretty clearly what it was like to have a psychotic episode. Now, this might not go into the medical language that we normally talk about, but I think if we're listening, we can actually hear what Amanda is saying. So if we move on, we can look at Ariane's descriptions. So Ariane Neeson, she wrote a autobiography about her experience postpartum psychosis. And it's an amazing book. And I think Amanda and Ariane, I should say, were both very successful women. Well, they still are very successful women. Amanda is a teacher. She was teaching kindergarten before she became unwell. And Ariane was a psychologist and was actually working in child protection services. Both have moved on to other jobs now. And Ariane's actually working for the Centre for Postnatal Excellence, where she is a research assistant, or I think she's a researcher there. And she wrote this book, and it's such a powerful book. It became a bestseller. So Ariane talked about what she said, and this is how she describes how she felt. She said, sad, I say. I'm just so sad. And then she says her baby's 7 months old, and I'm getting worse. My weight has dropped to 45 kilos. My limbs feel like lead, and I am so, so slow. I can't read. I can't find the right words. They stumble off my tongue and disappear. And then, wonderingly, she says, I don't want to live anymore. And between the 3 autobiographies, this sense of harming themselves or wanting to die is something that connects all 3 autobiographies over a 600-year period. And I think that's something we have to remember, that, these illnesses that come on, this distress that comes on after childbirth, can have very tragic and very serious consequences. Yeah. So here we've got more about the hallucinations that they're described and how people made meaning of their experiences. Now, they're not talking about symptoms. They're not saying, oh, well, I had this hallucination or I had this illusion. So what does Marjorie say? And in this time she saw, as she thought, devils opening her mouth all inflamed with burning flames, as she would have swallowed in her, sometimes pouring at her, sometimes threatening her, sometimes pulling her and dragging her both day and night during this time. So she could actually feel the devils around her. And then she's hearing these. She's also talking about auditory hallucinations. She said, and also the devil screamed at her in a very threatening manner and demanded that she abandons her Christian faith and denies God, his mother, and all the saints in heaven for good works and all good virtues, her father, her mother, and all her friends. So she's actually, I think at that time, she's actually talking about, abandoning a Christian faith means that she will go to hell. So to me, sometimes reading the whole thing, I think that what Marjorie's experienced for 8.5 months is an experience of being in hell. Amanda describes a hallucination or a delusion, which she said, one of the patients in the hospital, when she was in, I think it was Roselle Hospital, was an undercover policewoman, was looking after me. And then she says, and when I got out, we would work together to catch the paedophile. Now, I don't know who the paedophile is or what has happened, but this is what she believed was happening in her world at the time. And finally, Ariane said, because Ariane sort of, in many ways, guarded her symptoms till quite late. She was seen as being having a depression, but she guarded her symptoms. So her psychosis didn't come out for a long time. And here she said, I don't tell him I can't see the baby's face properly, that there's something wrong with him, and I don't know how to bond with him, that I can't, with what I can't see. I don't tell him that sometimes the baby turns into a dragon, just a flash and then it's gone. I don't tell him that I am starting to see death everywhere, that I think I'm already dead. And I think that's really interesting because she knows. I mean, this is the point we have to remember with all these women. They knew there was something very wrong with them during this period. They knew there was something wrong and no one was asking questions to find out about the psychosis. Now, Ariane here had opportunities to say, well, sometimes I look at my baby and he's changed form and whatever, but she didn't because as a psychologist, I guess she knew what the consequences were. But she did go through a period where she believed she was dead. And I personally looked after people who had a belief that they're dead or they don't have a stomach or whatever. And she keeps this quiet. So as you can see with each of these, that all the women are describing really, really strong psychotic symptoms.
Some very strong common thread that you back up here. I might ask this question, and it may link into where you're progressing, which is how can health professionals use the insights that these autobiographies gave you to improve care and support women experiencing postpartum psychosis?
Well, I guess what health professionals can do is they can really listen to the women and take what they're saying seriously and then ask probing questions. So if someone comes and says, I can't sleep, which so many of the women when we interviewed 10 women with a history of it, said no to listen to them. People would just say to them, oh, look, you just had a baby, of course you can't sleep. What they need to do is probe that to find out that the reason they can't sleep is because their baby's kicking them up, may not be feeding properly or whatever happens with the baby, or it is because there's another reason, such as they have some kind of psychotic reaction to childbirth and they can no longer fall asleep. It's just become something they can't do. So I think that's very much what they do. So, and also to remember that this should be considered a psychiatric emergency or a mental health emergency, that if a woman does have these symptoms, well, they need help straight away. And this help needs to be taken seriously. The other thing is that we have to think very carefully before we remove a child from their mother, even if it's just going to the husband, that we have to look at how we can help the mother continue to bond with her baby. One of the stories we used to get a lot with women is that they used to, even when they were put into mental health units, they'd keep wanting to breastfeed and they would be on the breast pump. And one woman talked about the experience of walking past the garbage bin and seeing all her breast milk in the garbage bin. So we need to realise what the women are doing and what they're doing, and we need to give them a lot of education on what has been happening with them. And I think in many ways, when we're talking about mental health services, looking after women, and I'm sure that this is what's happening in the mother-baby units, is that we have to have people with experience in midwifery or early childhood or child and family nursing to come in and help look after the women with the mental health nurses. This really needs to be an interdisciplinary and a collaborative event that we can do it. But we need to start taking these stories that women are doing very seriously and to listen to what they're happening. I just going back to the recovery, I think it's really interesting. Well, I won't go through Marjorie's. I'll let you read that. I think I've already talked about that. But Amanda talks about talking about her story with an SBS journalist. And that was something that was really therapeutic for her, finding someone who would listen to what happened to her. She said, after telling my story, I came to the illusion that this story didn't own me anymore. I owned it. So she needed to be able to talk out her experience. And I think as health professionals, we have to give people the opportunity to talk out what's happening. Because as we said before, both Amanda and both Ariane were incredibly successful women. They had good jobs. They were married. They were happily married. And yet no one was listening to what they were saying and giving them the benefit of the fact that they just really wanted to be heard. I think it's interesting what Ariane says because she talks within the autobiography about, not being able to love her baby and being really worried about that and that being a great concern. And she says she knew she was getting better was when she checked on the baby who was sound asleep and she laid down next to his body and felt his warmth. And suddenly she realised she was in love with that baby. Suddenly she bonded, so she knew she was better. And I just love that quote there. She said, I am smitten. When the love finally broke through the layers of depression, tearing at the numbness of my body and my mind, it didn't stop. It hasn't stopped. That's what she says. So we really need to listen, I think, and not just dismiss and say, oh, that's really rare. Doesn't happen. Because it does. So I guess here are my implications for health professionals. And that is to remember postpartum psychosis is frightening and traumatic. Women talk about how traumatized they were by this event. One of the ways that they find that they can actually feel better is that they talk with each other. A lot of women want to give back. They want to tell their story so other women don't have to go through what they went through, hence the autobiographies. But there is a private Facebook group. I think it's got 200 women involved now, and it goes across New Zealand and Australia, run by a wonderful woman. Well, I'm not going to say the name because for anonymity purposes, who started this group just so women could talk to each other about their experience. Because really, they didn't have anywhere else to go. Often, I think it was interesting that other times they would find an elderly psychiatrist who'd actually seen this before. And that's when they started to feel better because they found someone who listened to them. So I think what we have to say is we have to really listen to what women are saying. And I'll keep saying that. And we have to, if we pick up any sign of psychosis, it should never be dismissed. We really need to listen, and as health professionals, we need to know what's happening. One woman I think we interviewed says that, I think it was like day 2 in hospital while she had the baby, that she could see the flowers talking to her. And she said something to the nurses, or the midwives and the nurses, and then she overheard them laughing about it at the nurses' station, midwife station. So that was a moment when it could have been picked up. I mean, this is a long time ago now. This was, but it happened. So I guess a lot of women also want the opportunity to go and talk to other women about this so they can make a difference and stop women having these kinds of problems and to let them know what happens. I think it's also important to remember that 50% of women are likely to relapse if they have another child. So they have to be proved here. Anyway, that's just by and by. So here are the references if anyone's interested in the actual autobiographies. So if anybody wants to have a look at them, here they are. Um, you will find versions of Marjorie Kent in modern English. You may have to order them, but they do exist out there. But Ariane Beetson and Amanda Walsh Collins, you can still do. And yes, this is my version of Marjorie Kent. And here are the other two books that I brought in. They're all looking a bit, Marjorie's looking a bit haggard. And here is Amanda's book. And this is Ariane's book. I would encourage everyone to read them. They're good reads. They're really interesting. Yes.
Before we go to questions from our in-room and online audience, I'd like to say, how can we encourage more open dialogue and reduce stigma around postpartum mental health?
Well, it's interesting because I have a background in HIV/AIDS. So all through my nursing career, stigma was a big thing. And I think stigma is being reduced. I mean, young people today, I notice, when I'm talking to student nurses that, they do talk about their mental health and what happens. But many women have said, and it's been a lot in the literature, that they don't like to tell anyone how they're feeling because they're worried that the babies are going to be taken away. They're worried that they're going to be seen as being unfit to be a mother or that people think they're stupid. I think what we need to do is raise awareness around these issues, but people feel comfortable to go to the doctor and say, look, I think there's something really wrong with me. This is what's happening. Because all the women we spoke to, and I think it's described in this book, they knew that there was something very wrong. And it was always waiting to find the right person to talk to or letting things get really serious. I think there needs to be greater education, and I know that's happening in the Bachelor of Midwifery. They're talking about it now, but we need to have more education and we need to be more open to these things happening, and we need to be able to encourage women. Everyone has the embryo depression scale done throughout pregnancy, and after that, I don't know, perhaps there could be a question put on the end to help maybe people looking at psychosis on top of the embryo depression scale. Lots of ideas. Anyone like to come and work with me on that? Here I am.
Thank you, Diana. I mean, I wasn't even aware that mother and baby units existed in the mental hospitals. And I'm not sure about across the nation. It might be certain areas.
That's true. It's actually they're not in the mental hospitals now. They're at Westmead and at RPA, which is wonderful. But it's interesting that only just opened in New South Wales in the public, I think since 2020, whereas Victoria's had them since the 1980s. There's been a mental health unit in South Australia for many years, a mother and baby unit in South Australia for many years, and one in Western Australia. However, women in New South Wales, Australia's most populous state, did not have that kind of support unless they went to a private hospital, which is St John of God. So it is so fortunate now that women do have these units where they can go and they can take their babies and, they can recover with their babies and they don't break the bond. That bond's so important between mother and baby.
And I think maybe knowledge that these units exist might make people more comfortable to disclose because then they know they'll be together with their infant.
Well, Amanda, who wrote A Mother's Mind, I know she goes into RPA and I know she talks about it as well. Amanda is a great advocate for mental health after childbirth. She talks to MPs. She talks to the local council. She'll talk to anyone. She's amazing. And Ariane, of course, is working at Cope now. So we met, I met a lot of women who's had this illness, and every single one of them, they want to find ways of giving back. And it seems to be that they say, I don't want other people to go through what I went through. So it's a very traumatic time for these women.
Are there certain organisations or helplines that people can contact if they are worried themselves or other people?
Yes, there are. The main helpline is PANDA, PANDA. It is a website, and it has a helpline. There's also the Gidget Foundation in New South Wales. And I think really people could also talk to the mental health line as well. The PANDA and the Gidget Foundation. I think COPE has lots of information as well, COPD, Centre for Perinatal Excellence. And women can go on to those particular websites and get lots of information about mental illness following childbirth.
Thank you. We might go to question time now. Just saying that to, if you'd like to address this one.
I just saying, here's the research we did. I just thought I'd put it together, that these are all the papers that have been written about postnatal psychosis over the years.
Well, they're amazing. You've been very active in your publishing. Any questions in the room? Just raise your hand. The ceiling mics should pick you up. Speak nice and loud. Okay. In that case, oh, yep, no. Yes. Lucy, thank you.
Thanks, Diana, for a wonderful presentation. It was really interesting. I'm just wondering where to from here with your research in this space?
Well, with this particular research, there is a maternal mental health and wellbeing symposium next week at Western Sydney University. And part of what happened, I think, and I know she's online, Lisa Brickle, she took my historical research and put it into a play called Mockingbird, which is now called Shush. And during COVID times, made a film. So next week, Lisa will be presenting the film Unlatched at Westmead in the Innovation Quarter for anyone who'd like to come to this particular day-long symposium or morning symposium. So if you do, please let me know and I'll send you the link to look through with that. So I guess really it's now moving into this particular space where the film is being put into film festivals. I think it's going to be shown at a film festival in Perth at the end of October, and it's going to go into the midwifery. So a lot of it's going to go into education. So I guess the work that will next happen will be around how do we evaluate the effectiveness of education programs based on this.
Sorry, I was going to ask you about the play Mockingbird, and you just mentioned it. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about it and the fact that it's being made into a film?
Yes, Mockingbird, now known as Shush. A few years ago, I did some historical research across from my autobiographies where I actually went out to Kingswood and I looked at archival healthcare records of women who'd been admitted to either Roselle or Helen Park from 1885 to 1955, and they had a diagnosis of psychosis. Anyway, it was all very sad. The stories were terrible, and I used to go to conferences that present this particular research, and someone called Tony Allen came up to me, and Tony said, "Oh, my friend Lisa Brickle should talk to you." So Lisa was writing a play about 4 generations of her family who had had mental ill health in New Zealand. So she took my research and she put it into the play. So that was amazing to have that happen. The play has now gone to New Zealand. It's been to Melbourne and Sydney, but it also went to the Adelaide Festival last year, Fringe Festival. It went to Avignon Festival in France. and it went to the Amber Festival. So it's been all over New Zealand and quite a few places in Australia. So, of course, we had all kinds of plans to expand it. Then COVID happened and all performance was closed down. So we raised money, and thank you, I think, to THREE, the Translational Health Research Institute of Western Sydney University, and to everyone who went through our crowdfunding. We managed to raise just enough money, and I mean just enough money, to make a short film based on the experience of a mother who has mental ill health and what happens to the impediment. It's called Unlatched. So coming to a film festival near you, hopefully. So if you have an opportunity to see it, please go out and see it. You know, getting into film festivals is quite a strenuous process. It doesn't happen overnight, no matter how good you think the film is, but it's blooming away with Unlatched. And it will go, and it should be going into the Bachelor of Midwifery next year as a resource to talk to midwives about what happens with women when they had these experiences. And yes, it was amazing. I should add that Tony Allen, who's initially approached me at this conference at the Art Gallery in Sydney, she's now the South Australian Mental Health Commissioner. So it's good to have friends in high places when you're doing this stuff. Yes, Tony gave money last year to support the art presentation of Mockingbird, of Shush, at the Adelaide Fringe Festival. So we've been very lucky.
Amazing. I look forward to seeing. So we'll go up another question in the room. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I just wondered, in terms of thinking about next steps in education, have you had any interest from GPs in this research? Because that might be another area that could reach out to women.
Well, I think we should reach out to GPs. I think women probably, and I think caseworker midwives, midwives who followed someone through their pregnancy and they know what's happened to the women and they can see when there's a big change. And I think also we need to talk. It's true, we do. That's a very good suggestion. That we do need to talk to GPs because they can see the difference in women. But yeah, thank you for that.
Brilliant. Now we might go to our online audience. Badra, if you just read out the questions really loudly.
There is a question from Tracy Stanbrook. Did any of the women in the study talk about experiences of early trauma or violence get mixed in with the psychosis experiences?
Now, that idea of trauma-informed care and early experience with psychosis, nothing came out about any kind of abuse or something that happened in childhood. But we did have experiences during pregnancy where women became very anxious. One woman talked about having a cyst on her baby's lung that was sort of seen on ultrasound very early on and sort of didn't disappear till very late in the pregnancy, always being worried. Another person we spoke to, their child was born early and ended up in the NICU, and she was incredibly worried about the child. So there were things like that. But I think one of the most interesting things that we were told by someone, and I think it just shows that you need to do a really good history, was that one person, their grandmother died just as they'd become pregnant. They said they were 7 weeks pregnant. They really wanted to tell her. And she was really upset about it. Now, you needed to probe that to find out that her mother had an episode of depression. They'd gone into hospital and it was her grandmother who looked after her when she was a very small baby. So her grandmother was the primary carer and there was a big trauma there. So you really do need to look at that. Might be an interesting way of looking at research because often it can be relationships with mothers that sometimes these women were talking about, difficult relationships that sometimes have women experiencing some kind of mental distress after childbirth. We haven't done enough work on that, but it might be something that we could look at in the future. Next one.
I got a question. No questions from online. What ethical considerations arise when using personal narratives in academic or clinical research?
Considerations, personal narratives. Wow.
Well, you have to make sure that, you have to be very careful. You have to protect people's anonymity. And that's what we did with our particular research with the 10 women we interviewed. We had to protect their anonymity, which was very deep. So we gave them other names. We gave them pseudonyms. And we just took out all references to hospitals or family names and whatever and made it very general. But the other thing is you had to stay true to the data. I'm a great believer in this, that the women are telling me their story. I shouldn't have been interpreting that story. I shouldn't be putting my own 2 cents worth in. To me, what is ethical is to listen to the story and to do my work based on their description and to work from their description. I can see other ethical considerations is I have to make sure the women know exactly what's going on. So I need a good participant information sheet and I have to get their consent. And I have to realise that if a woman says halfway through an interview, I want to stop, no more, and I don't want to go in the study anymore, no matter how much I might want to, that information can't go into the data. Interestingly, I had to get ethics approval to do this talk today, and I'd like to thank Ariane and Amanda for both signing a consent form and allowing me to do this. So even with that, because as ethics said to me, you'll be delving into people's lives and their life. I have to make sure that they know that this is happening and that they are happy with it, even though they're published works. So yes, there are a lot of ethical minefields out there.
Ariane Wheatson is here. It's online, and she's thanking you for including her.
Oh,
Amazing.
tell Ariane she deserves to be included. It's a wonderful book. But she and Amanda wrote wonderful books, and I am so pleased that I can publicise these books because a lot of people should read them. They're amazing. They should be in the Western Sydney Library, aren't they? They're in the Western Sydney Library if you're looking for them.
Anything else on chat battle?
Yeah, just thanks for your presentation.
Thank you. People want to do research in this field. I think one of the things I was really lucky is I met someone who I met the person who set up a Facebook group and she helped me get my participants. I think you've actually got to get an insider, someone who's had it and who knows other people, because there is a lot of stigma around this illness. And I think that you need someone who can help you meet other people and can advocate for you as being a researcher who will be sensitive and who will take what they're saying seriously. When it comes to autobiographies and stuff, well, Marjorie Kemp, start with that. I just have to say the reason I found out about Marjorie Kemp is I was talking to a professor of Middle English in Perth. And I said, oh, have you heard of anything that was written in that period about childbirth? And he said, oh, yeah, look at Marjorie Kemp. And that's where my journey started. But the other thing is talk to people. Talk to people with what you're interested in. You never know where people can send you. So thank you.